Hi there, my name's Simon Parkin. I'm a British author and journalist, and I'm thrilled to be taking part in the Digital Tabletop Fest. Today I'm going to be talking to you about a war game that was developed and used by the British Navy during the Second World War, and which helped turn the tide of the Allies' battle against the U-boats in the Atlantic. Just before I start, I want to mention that this talk is based on a much longer book about the war game and the unit that designed it, called A Game of Birds and Wolves, and it's available to buy online and in all good bookshops. When I was a child, my brother and I spent our summer holidays at our grandparents' house in Devon. They loved board games and had an old wooden chest filled with them. And one day, in among the boxes of Scrabble, Monopoly and Bagatelle, we found a copy of Battleships. Now, this wasn't the plastic tabletop version with which you're all familiar, but a luxurious version of the game, which was played out on a giant map that had to be spread across the entire floor. We'd take turns to throw the dice and manoeuvre our ships into opposing positions, and then at the press of a button on a destroyer, a small plastic disc would fire along the glossy board like a miniature hockey puck. If your aim was true, the disc would slot into a hole at the base of your target, and then through some toy maker's magic, the top of the ship would fire into the air like a cap rocketing from a shaken bottle of lemonade. My grandfather never spoke much about the war. I knew that he had been a merchant seaman, but not when or where he had sailed or even if he had seen combat at sea, and as such I never put together why he might own this particular game, or why he would often watch from the doorway while we played. A couple of years ago, I started working on a radio documentary for the New Yorker on wargaming. If you're not familiar, wargaming is a tool that's used by politicians, civil servants and the military to explore, via the medium of dice and play, the potential effects of world events. Recently, for example, the British government has used wargames to envision the potential effects of a second referendum, forcing civil servants to role-play as Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson and other leading figures in the Brexit drama. While in America, plenty of war games are being played right now to see what might happen with whatever the outcome is of the forthcoming US election. During the making of that programme, I visited the Defence Academy in Shrivenham in Britain, and there I met a man called Major Tom Muat. Major Tom is essentially Her Majesty's game designer-in-chief, a kind of Dungeons & Dragons moderator dressed in khaki fatigues. He's designed and run war games everywhere from the Pentagon to Beijing. I asked Tom if he had an example of where something learned in the crucible of a war game had gone on to be used in the real world. He explained that the hotline that links the White House to the Kremlin, often represented in films by a red telephone, was an idea that came out of war games played during the Cold War. Then he mentioned a little-known story about a retired naval captain called Gilbert Roberts and a group of young women who invented a war game that radically changed the course of the Second World War. In the last week of 1941, Britain had come perilously close to defeat. The UK is an island nation, reliant on imported goods for much of its resources, and at that time no less than 95% of England's fuel came into the country from trading partners and colonies, while 70% of its food supply was also imported. In total, an average of 68 million tonnes of food and fuel was delivered by a 3,000-strong merchant shipping fleet. The sailors of these ships knew from the bitter experience of the First World War that the safest way to cross the Atlantic Ocean was to move in convoys, finding safety in numbers. So they would gather together in groups, sometimes consisting of more than 60 vessels, and sail in tight formation. The Royal Navy then sent warships to protect these flocks of boats. These escorts, as the protectors were known, encircled the convoy as it plodded its heavy-laden course, exactly like sheepdogs protecting a herd ready to fend off any attacks. Even before the outbreak of the Second World War, Karl Dönitz, leader of the U-boat arm of the German Navy, reasoned that if his fleet of submarines could block and sink these convoy ships, Britain, an island unable to sustain its people without imports, would soon starve. In this way, hunger, the blunt, persistent weapon of war, could be deployed against Germany's enemy from a position of remove. Dönitz had long believed the most effective way to attack the British ships was to organise his U-boats into packs, like wolves hunting those sheep. It was a tactic that he had tentatively explored as a captain of a U-boat in the First World War, just before he was captured by the British and sent to a prisoner of war camp in Sheffield. Incidentally, he managed to earn a prison transfer to a lunatic asylum after he pretended to be a U-boat, convincing his captors that he had lost his mind. The Rugel tactic, or wolf pack tactic, was borrowed from the wolves of his childhood fairy tales. Wolves, Dönitz knew, hunt cooperatively. By working together as a pack, they can bewilder and run down prey that would be too large to tackle alone. Togetherness also affords the animals the ability to care for wounded pack animals without sacrificing momentum. What better way, Dönitz reasoned, for U-boats to hunt, not as loners picking off stragglers, but as an organised pack touring the sea with shared focus and intention, able to take down far stronger foes than they might otherwise. The belief that if Britain's supply lines were broken, defeat would soon follow was not limited to the Germans. Prime Minister Winston Churchill described merchant shipping as at once the stranglehold and sole foundation of our war strategy. This fundamental truth was acknowledged in a chart that took up almost the entirety of a wall in the operations room at the Admiralty, the Navy's London headquarters. This graph charted the number of ships that had been sunk at sea and showed in the starkest terms imaginable the stakes at play. The top quarter was divided by a thin red line that marked the narrow threshold between victory and defeat. If the rate of ship sinking stayed below the line, the British people could survive on the amount of food and fuel that was making it through. But if the graph exceeded the red line, the country could no longer continue to participate in the war. While Dönitz was not given anywhere close to the 300 U-boats he estimated via war games that he needed to blockade Britain, the embryonic wolfpack attacks that began towards the end of 1940 immediately showed their effectiveness. In British shops, fish became scarce and expensive, while butter, bacon and sugar could only be bought with coupons. Onions, prior to the war, were imported from Spain, France and the Channel Islands, now vanished from greengrocers, as did lemons and bananas. The frequency and success of the U-boat attacks steadily climbed, and by the end of 1940 the U-boats had sunk more than 1,200 ships, about 5 years' worth of construction work in typical peacetime conditions, and more than the rest of all the German Navy and Luftwaffe combined. The numbers told, if not the whole story of the Battle of the Atlantic, then at least the salient point. The British were losing catastrophically. Someone had to figure out what was making the U-boats so effective, and what, if anything, might be done to upturn that success. Gilbert Roberts was a 41-year-old former naval commander who had been discharged from the Navy in 1938 following a bout of tuberculosis. After he recovered from illness, Roberts found himself a young retiree with neither a ship nor a purpose. He joined the Home Guard for a stint, then worked as a police officer in a Devon constabulary. But neither of these roles suited Roberts, who was a talented tactician and wargame designer. He was a heroic man even before the arrival of war and its inevitable provocations towards courage. Once, while reading a book on a Cornish cliffside, Roberts spied a group of walkers as they struggled to climb from the mouth of a cave against the tide's rushing. Roberts tripped down the cliff, jumped into the water and for more than an hour fought the waves to recover one of the sightseers. In the early months of war, Roberts was further tested by circumstance. One night during the Blitz, while sheltering in the basement of his South London accommodation, Roberts heard a thud on the ground above. He climbed the stairs to peek through the window, and there, in the white light of an overhead flare, saw a bent, oily German bomb, half buried in the pavement, its fuse still sparking. Roberts ran towards the danger, snatched out the fuse, and burned his fingers in the process. Now, in the last week of 1941, Roberts received an unexpected summons to the Admiralty officers. He was told to bring an overnight bag, and there he met two of the Navy's most senior officers, one an aide to Winston Churchill. Together the two men described the true extent of Britain's ongoing losses in the Atlantic. That Britain had come so close to starvation had deliberately been kept from the British public. Churchill would routinely exaggerate the number of U-boat losses in his public speeches. For example, at Mansion House on the 20th of January 1940, at a moment when British forces had sunk just 9 of Germany's 57 operational U-boats, Churchill claimed to have sunk half the U-boats with which Germany began the war. To arrive at this conclusion, he had added 16 boats that the Admiralty believed may have been sunk to the 9 that they were sure had been sunk, and to this number, for good measure, he added a further 10 U-boats of his own imagining. So when Roberts was told the awful truth of the situation, he was astonished. He was then informed that because of his achievements in running war games, he had been chosen to figure out the secret to the U-boat's success in the Atlantic. Robert's task was threefold: discover the secret of how the U-boats were operating, develop effective countermeasures, and finally teach these new tactics, whatever they may be, to any and every captain who sailed the Atlantic. Tuberculosis had robbed him of the chance to serve at sea, but it had, in this unlikely way, provided him with an opportunity by which he could make his presence felt on every destroyer and corvette on the ocean. Before he left the Admiralty to catch the midnight train to Liverpool, Roberts was led into an office where he came face to face with Churchill, who barked, "Find out what is happening and sink the U-boats." Roberts arrived in Liverpool to a beleaguered city. Hitler would later admit that he targeted Liverpool with his bombers because he believed it housed the headquarters from which the Battle of the Atlantic was being orchestrated. His guess was, in fact, correct. Derby House, home to this command centre, had already been successfully hit by German incendiaries, although the bombers wouldn't have known it. When Roberts arrived, he was informed that he would be given 8 rooms on the top floor of the building. He could move in just as soon as the roof had been repaired. Roberts' first meeting with the Commander-in-Chief, Sir Percy Noble, was a complete disaster. After dismissively asking what precisely Roberts planned to do with these games, Noble told him, "Well, you can carry on, but don't bother me with it, I'm busy." The next question was who precisely was going to assist Roberts in his work. Now, by 1942, most men who were able to serve in the Navy had been enlisted and deployed. The Navy, in its desperation to find workers, had turned to young women, advertising posts in the Wrens with the slogan, "Join the Wrens and free a man for the fleet." The Wrens' motto at the time was "Never at sea," a pledge that also carries with it a sort of negative space assurance. We know our place. What other organisation has ever been defined by what its members are forbidden from doing, rather than what they hope to achieve? Nevertheless, under the stewardship of Vera Lawton Matthews, a former activist for the suffragettes, the Wrens were gradually deployed to all manner of interesting and essential roles. Some became welders, others became carpenters, some loaded torpedoes onto submarines, and many plotted the course of live sea battles on maps hung in operation rooms, just like the giant plot at Derby House. The Wrens' heroism was often matched that of the men they had freed for duty. In 1942, for example, Pamela McGeorge was asked to deliver an important dispatch from one side of Plymouth to the Commander-in-Chief at the other. She drove her motorcycle through the night while the Luftwaffe dropped bombs on the city. When one of these bombs landed close to the road, McGeorge was blown from her bike. Its wheels were mangled beyond repair. Yet, undeterred, she continued on foot to Admiralty House with the letter in her hand, and on arrival she offered immediately to head out again with the response. Now, at Derby House, Roberts was introduced to 10 young Wrens, some of whom had only recently left school, and who were to be his supporting team. They had been handpicked for their aptitude in mathematics and statistics and game playing. The first and most senior woman assigned to the team was Jean Laidlaw, an assiduous 21-year-old who was obsessed with ships and sailing, and who later became one of Britain's first female chartered accountants. Then there was Laura Janet Howes, who had come to England from Antigua just 4 years earlier. Howes was a mathematical wonderkind, and at school, when her teachers were off sick, Howes would teach the class maths in their stead. Elizabeth Drake was next. Drake's father, Charles, worked as an actuary for the Prudential Assurance Company. Drake was chosen to work with Roberts based on the assumption that an aptitude for maths, like height or temper, runs in the family. The last of the Wren officers was a sportswoman, Nancy Wales. Nan, as she was known to her friends, was older than the others at 27, but she was a formidable tennis player and competed in badminton for the county. Hockey, however, was her true passion. 2 years later she would play for Lancashire and then earn the unique distinction of being the only player to go on to play for their arch-rivals Yorkshire, a team that she captained for many years. The unit, which became known as the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, or WATU, was given the top floor of Derby House. As Roberts' dismal first meeting with his superior, Percy Noble, demonstrated, the unit was viewed with tremendous scepticism by many senior officers, who wondered what these people were doing playing games, especially while there was a war on. As such, Roberts and his team of Wrens worked quietly in their top floor home trying not to attract much attention till they had something concrete to bring to their superiors. WATU's office resembled something between a school gymnasium and, thanks to the scattered sticks of chalk and tumbles of string laying about, a child's playroom. The linoleum floor was divided into sections like a giant chessboard, and each line was spaced 10 inches apart, representing a single nautical mile, while the counters represented ships and surfaced German U-boats. Around the edges of the room stood great sheets of white canvas. They were arranged into enclosures a bit like voting booths, except each one had a peephole cut into it at eye level. The average visibility from the bridge of a warship is 5 miles, and the canvas sheets were positioned in such a way that when a player peeked through the slit, he or she could see the equivalent of a 5-mile view of the tiny wooden ships down on the floor. Linen sidewires, which could be bent to adjust visibility depending on the game scenario that was being played, held the apertures open. One team was positioned behind the canvas sheets at desks. They played as the escort captains, protecting the convoy. The other team, which was usually captained by Roberts or his right-hand woman, Jean Laidlaw, played as the U-boats. As in the real battles of the Atlantic happening out at sea, each side's objective was focused on the convoy ships. The team playing as the escorts had to protect them. The team playing as the U-boats had to attack and sink them. And each side had a secondary objective. For the escort ships, this was to sink as many U-boats as possible, while for the U-boats, the aim was to avoid detection and exit the battlefield unharmed. The convoy ships, the prize in play for both sides, would automatically plod on at each turn of the game towards their destination, while the battle raged around them, just at sea. Players were given 2 minutes in which to submit their orders for the next turn to replicate the urgency of a real battlefield, while the movements of the U-boats were drawn in green chalk on the floor. The colour was chosen as it was impossible to make out against the floor's tint when viewed from an angle. This ensured that the U-boat positions were undetectable to the players peering through the canvas sheets, a kind of fog of war as we would know it now in video games. The escort ship's movements would then be added to the floor in white chalk, which was in contrast to the green markings legible to those peeking through the canvas holes, and then turn by turn the pieces would move around the floor as the escort ships dashed to the site of an explosion to drop their depth charges, and the U-boats performed their feints and dodges in an effort to pick off convoy ships while avoiding the escort. The young women acted as something like umpires. They would measure the distances and mark movements in the chalk to ensure that the game played out as accurately as possible. Then, finally, at the end of the game, the players would all come together, sit around the board, which was now crisscrossed with chalk markings. Roberts would reveal how everyone had fared. The game was a simplification of real U-boat action, of course, but there was enough here to begin restaging recent sea battles that had actually happened. The objective here was to experience the action from the perspective of the U-boats, and from that knowledge to assess whether the escort commanders might have done something different to save ships, supplies and lives. The rudiments of the game in place, Roberts spent a great deal of his time studying after-action reports written by naval officers who had battled U-boats and survived, in search of clues to the German tactics. His position at Derby House meant he was ideally situated to meet and quiz any and every naval officer who passed through Western Approach's command. Roberts did not have to rely solely on the rather staid written testimony of sailors. He could also interview and listen to first-hand accounts of men as they returned from sea. During the course of these interviews, a chaotic picture emerged. Not only was there no universal set of tactics with which to fight U-boats, neither was there any training for how escort ships should work together as a team. The destroyers and corvettes, it seemed to Roberts, were broadly free to direct their response according to their captain's individual whim or notion. Fred Osborne, who was first lieutenant of the corvette HMS Gentian and who later worked at WATU for a number of months, described convoy defence at the time as difficult and haphazard, without collective countermeasures to guide. No clear doctrine for combating attacks on convoys has been formulated and taught, he wrote, and as such, the losses are appalling. Roberts asked every escort captain he interviewed the same question. What do you do when one of your merchant ships is torpedoed by a U-boat? Some of the captains spoke of going to action stations, and others said they increased their speed. But when pressed, most shrugged in resignation. What could you do, blind in the night, with explosions sounding all around, when your radar operator was unable to distinguish the sound of a U-boat cleaving the water from the noise of a choppy sea, or even a shoal of fish? There was another reason why the naval escorts were having such an awful time hunting U-boats, an incorrect assumption about the way in which U-boats were attacking that had resulted in thousands of deaths at sea. Roberts didn't know it yet, but his task in turning around Allied fortunes at sea would rest on his successfully spotting this cardinal error in the British understanding of how U-boats were operating. To understand this error, we need to meet this man, the 28-year-old Otto Kretschmer, perhaps the most famous of Germany's so-called U-boat aces. The young commander was taciturn and focused. One of his nicknames was Silent Otto, but he inspired utter loyalty from his crew, many of whom were young men, barely out of school. Kretschmer's contribution to German U-boat strategy was profound. In the early months of the war, U-boat captains would attack Allied ships from outside the boundary of the convoy. This was in part to abide by a recommendation from the manufacturers of their torpedoes, which advised ensuring a distance of no less than 1 kilometre between a U-boat and its target. Uncertainty about the effectiveness of British sonar detection, which was known at the time as ASDIC, led many U-boats to fire their torpedoes only from well outside the detection range of the escorts, at a range of 3,000 metres or even farther. Kretschmer, however, wanted to see what would happen if he could slip past the naval escort ships, enter the lanes of the convoy ships, and fire at them from practically point-blank range. His motto was "one ship, one torpedo," and the less distance between the U-boat and its target, the easier it would be to adhere to. Kretschmer first attempted the manoeuvre in September 1940. One night he slunk in between the escort ships and the cover of darkness on the surface of the water, thereby evading detection by sonar. Then, like a fox inside a henhouse, he successfully sank 3 ships, firing torpedoes at pretty much point-blank range. When he returned to his U-boat base in the captured French port of Lorient later that month, Kretschmer wrote up his findings in a set of standing orders for his crew. The document laid out the rules for the efficient and successful running of a U-boat, a 12-point plan that covered everything from the need for an effective lookout through to the requirement the men set aside time to clean their dishes. Most of Kretschmer's instructions were commonsensical. Point 9, however, went against the written advice that U-boat captains maintain a minimum distance of 1 kilometre between their ship and its target. Kretschmer countered plainly that at every given opportunity, torpedoes should only be fired at extreme close range. This can only be done, he wrote, by penetrating the escort's anti-submarine screen and getting inside the convoy lanes. This, he added, should be the objective of all of our attacks. In 2 sentences, Kretschmer had outlined a tactic that would, in the months to come, lead to the deaths of thousands of sailors, and raise the line on the chart of shipping losses at the Admiralty in London perilously close to the threshold of defeat. One of WATU's first tasks was to restage a battle from a few weeks earlier in December 1941, in which the British ships had, for once, successfully hunted 3 U-boats. Roberts and his team believed that this, the battle for convoy HG-76, held the secrets they were searching for. The team arranged 48 ships in 12 columns, and then they added the tracks of the 3 U-boats which were known to have participated in the battle, U-434, 574 and 131. With the stage set, Roberts began to move the convoy, which spread across 6 white lines on the floor to represent its 6-mile width, in 2-minute intervals, at a simulated rate of 10 knots. Each move was made in precisely the same pattern as the actual escort had made a few weeks earlier. Blow by blow, Roberts imitated the action, as per the official reports. Now, seeing the battle from his crow's nest perspective above the board, a question formed in his mind. If the U-boats were firing from outside the perimeter of the convoy, as was widely believed, how had HMS Anavor, which was in the centre of the convoy, been sunk? Might it be possible, he wondered, that the U-boat had attacked the ship from inside the columns of the convoy? There was, he reasoned, a simple way to prove his theory. Hold everything, he told his staff, as he rushed into his office to make a phone call. Roberts picked up the receiver and asked the operator to put him through to the Flag Officer Submarines in London, hoping to speak to its Chief of Staff, an old friend, Captain Ian McIntyre. But to Roberts' astonishment, the Flag Officer himself, Admiral Sir Max Horton, one of the most senior members of the Navy, picked up. Horton was an officer of foreboding distinction. As a young submarine commander, he had scored the first naval kill of the Great War. On return to port, he would signal success to cheering onlookers by flying the pirate's flag, the Jolly Roger, a tradition that would continue thereafter until at least the end of the Falklands War. Horton's precocious talent as a submariner propelled him up the ranks, and years later his biographer described the Admiral as the greatest authority on submarine warfare. On the phone, Roberts explained who he was and asked Horton if he might be permitted to ask a question. During the last war, Roberts asked, would you ever have crept among the ships of a convoy to fire a torpedo? Of course, replied Horton. It's the only way of pressing home an attack. Thank you, sir, said Roberts, and hung up the phone. It was late, but Roberts asked Laidlaw and one of the younger Wrens, Janet O'Kell, to stay behind with him, reset the game, and run a new plot on the giant board. The two women, infused with Roberts' excitement, agreed and hurriedly reset the game. This time Roberts placed a U-boat model in the centre of the columns of the convoy and ran the events of the battle in reverse. If the range of its torpedoes was around 2.5 miles, it was reasonable to imagine that U-boat captains would fire from less than half that distance to maximise their chance of scoring a hit. Between them, Roberts and the Wrens began to plot different scenarios that might have enabled this U-boat to sneak into the convoy without being detected. Only one checked out. The U-boat must have entered the columns of the convoy from astern, and it must have done so on the surface of the water, where it was able to travel at a faster speed than the ships it was pursuing. And then, by approaching from stern, where the lookouts rarely checked, the U-boat must have been able to slip inside the convoy undetected, fire at close range, and then simply submerge in order to get away. Roberts and the Wrens headed to the kitchen to make coffee and a round of corned beef sandwiches. There the conversation continued to centre on the battle they had left suspended on the floor of the game room. The group discussed how, if they were a U-boat captain having made a point-blank range attack on a merchant ship, they might then attempt to escape unharmed. The game had enabled the fledgling tacticians to think like U-boat captains, and from this new perspective the answer seemed obvious. You'd make your attack, and then you'd simply dive, wait for the convoy to roll on overhead. Eventually, Roberts concluded, I would emerge deep from the stern of the convoy. With Kretschmer's U-boat tactic abruptly unveiled, Roberts wanted to try out some potential countermeasures that might foil the plan. The team returned to the game room. Roberts assumed the role of U-boat captain, and Laidlaw and O'Kell played as the escort ships. A countermeasure revealed itself immediately. Rather than splay out from the convoy at speed and drop depth charges at random, as was current common practice, Laidlaw and O'Kell lined the escort ships up around the convoy. While the convoy continued on its way, each escort ship performed a triangular sweep, listening for U-boats on the Azdig. When they did this, they immediately picked up the position of the attackers under the water. With a mounting sense of excitement, the team ran the procedure twice more, and in both instances Roberts' U-boat was detected and sunk. It was by now the early hours of the morning. In all the excitement, time had passed unnoticed, so Roberts ordered a staff car to return the two young women home. The next morning, Roberts invited the sceptical Admiral Percy Noble to watch a demonstration of their findings. Noble entered the game room flanked by his staff. The commander-in-chief warily eyed the chalk markings on the floor and the canvas sheets that were decked out like ship portholes. What was all this make-believe nonsense? Undeterred, Roberts began to explain their discoveries, how the U-boats would slip between the convoy ships on the surface of the water at night when they were unlikely to be spotted, how they would make their attacks and then dive to wait until the danger had passed. The atmosphere was frosty. Noble had made no secret of his condescension towards WATU's work. Roberts detected in Noble's manner a note of snootiness. How could this formal naval officer with his bits of chalk and jumbles of string contribute anything to the battles being waged at sea? But as the game played out, the Admiral began to sit forward in his chair in astonishment. One of the Wrens, playing as a U-boat, fired a torpedo from within the convoy's columns on the floor, then dived. Roberts performed the team's newly developed counter-tactic, moving the escort ships in these triangular sweeping patterns designed to flush out any hidden U-boat. And while performing the sweeps, one of the escort ships picked up the German's position on its radar. As he watched, Noble saw, for the first time, the errors that had been responsible for such a tremendous loss of life at sea. When the demonstration was finished, the Admiral stood to his feet, congratulated Roberts, and asked what the manoeuvre was to be called. Jean Laidlaw, a 21-year-old woman responsible for statistical analysis, explained that she had christened it Raspberry. It was, she said, a razz of contempt aimed at Hitler and his U-boats. The Commander-in-Chief then turned to one of his men and told him to take down a message to be sent immediately to the Prime Minister. The first investigations have shown a cardinal error in U-boat tactics, it read. A new, immediate and concerted counterattack will be signalled to the fleet within 24 hours. Raspberry was a revolutionary tactic, and its effect on the war profound. Shortly after the demonstration to Noble, WATU began running week-long courses for naval officers who would play imaginary battles and learn how to perform the counter-tactics, which soon included a variety of other operations, each named after a different fruit. For the officers playing as escort commanders behind the canvas peepholes, the games were keenly intense. The pressure of the 2-minute intervals between turns mimicked the stress of action against U-boats at sea. Each officer would often be caught up in the fiction, no longer viewing the chalk lines of wooden models on the floor as mere game pieces, but as the real ships, wakes and explosions that they represented. The game occupied an unusual position between reality and make-believe. No limbs or lives were lost here on the linoleum ocean, but neither was the game fully abstracted in the way that Monopoly is based on, but distinct from, the property business. For the men who played WATU's game, who had often returned from sea just a few days earlier, and who were often due to sail again a few days later, the game had an unsettling quality. The choices they made on the floor reflected an officer's current tactical thinking. If his ship was lost in the game, the man had to cope with the knowledge that, had the same situation arisen at sea, and he acted in the same way, he may well have died. Make your mistakes here, and you won't make them at sea, Roberts was fond of saying, a euphemistic way of pointing out the scale of risk against which the game was attempting to insure its players. For all Roberts' engaging presentation, a man who failed to drive off a U-boat, or worse, who lost his ship in the game, would leave WATU feeling sternly chastened. We destroy U-boats out in the oceans, wrote one observer who sat in on a round of the game, but the death sentence is delivered miles away, in the Assize Court, in that old building erected on the banks of the River Mersey. Course which lasted from Monday to Saturday and which ran weekly without interruption from the first week of February 1942 to the last week of July 1945 involved up to 50 officers at once. It consisted of 4 game scenarios which each varied details such as the weather conditions, visibility, time of day and the size, speed and start point of the convoy. And finally, when the game was finished, the officers would step from behind the canvas screens and, along with the Wrens, sit in a square of chairs around the room. Then, with a 10-foot wooden pole, Roberts would commentate on the preceding battle, blow by blow, like a sports pundit delivering a post-match verdict. He would draw attention to moments of particular brilliance, moments of particular disaster, and the turning points of each game. These summations were, for Roberts, the most enjoyable aspect of the work. He relished the opportunity to create a picture of the battle far more vivid and engaging than those reports written by officers returning from earnest action at sea. As we listened to him, he made the most difficult situation appear simple, said Vice Admiral Gilbert Stevenson of Roberts' Flair. He appreciated the difficulty that hundreds of commanding officers had in deciding what to do when faced with any of the surprises that war at sea constantly presents, and he taught them how to meet these surprises till they were ready for anything. The combination of administration and expertise was not always welcomed by the experienced officers on the receiving end of advice from the Wrens. Often the men would resent being told what to do, no matter how gently, by young women who were barely out of school and who, in many cases, had never been to sea in peacetime, let alone during a war. During one 1942 game, Bob Winnie, who captained the destroyer HMS Wanderer, in which he sank 3 U-boats, handed his instructions in the game to one of the Wrens, Judy de Vivier, who was a particularly clued-up girl, as he put it, who he had been assigned. "No, sir," she said of Winnie's chosen move, "I do not think that you should do that." Good God, he later recalled thinking of her firm and polite request. What on earth does this girl know about it? So confident and tactful was de Vivier's tone, however, that Winnie chose to hear her out. He listened to the Wren's convincing explanation in astonishment. From his perspective, a battle-worn captain was being tutored on the finer points of U-boat warfare by an inexperienced girl. For Roberts, the exchange vindicated a long-held belief. With careful design, games have the capacity to make experts of amateurs and to instill in players invaluable, potentially life-saving, battle-winning experience. In the summer of 1942, escort ships sank 4 times as many U-boats as in the previous month, beginning an upward trend that would continue broadly for the rest of the year. And in the months that followed the development of Raspberry, using information gleaned via debriefs, Roberts and the Wrens developed numerous other tactical manoeuvres to suit the expanding variety of Wolfpack attacks. Many of these manoeuvres, which involved the escort ships performing different shapes and varieties of coordinated sweeps to find and flush out lurking U-boats, were given the memorable names of fruit and vegetables: pineapple, gooseberry, strawberry, artichoke, and a modification of the original manoeuvre that was known as a half-raspberry. The unit revolutionised British anti-submarine warfare, and by the summer of 1943 the U-boats had been decisively driven from the Atlantic. During the period that the Germans subsequently dubbed Black May, the German Navy lost 41 U-boats, many to WATU-coined operations. It was a decisive tally on this, the impersonal scoresheet of war. Karl Dönitz, who was by now the Grand Admiral of the German Navy, and who never lost his first love of U-boats or the young men who crewed them, ordered the withdrawal of Wolfpacks from the Atlantic battlefield. It was, he urged, merely a partial change of operations. But 4 months later, the US Admiral Ernest King downgraded the U-boats to the category of problem rather than menace. In the 17 weeks that followed the 17th of May 1943, the Allies sailed 62 east and westbound convoys along the North Atlantic routes without losing a single ship to a U-boat. More than 12 million tons of food and supplies arrived unimpeded into Britain from eastbound convoys. Seizing the opportunity, senior officers at the Admiralty increased the size of convoys, which by June 1943 averaged 62 merchant ships, compared to just 43 the previous month. The so-called tonnage war was finished, and with it, in most ways that mattered, the Battle of the Atlantic. The first week of February 1942 and the last of July 1945, when WATU officially closed, close to 5,000 naval officers played the war game run by Captain Roberts and the Wrens during more than 130 courses. Graduates included the ornithologist and painter Peter Scott, who was remembered by one of the WATU Wrens for drawing ducks all over his navigational chart, and also a young Philip Mountbatten, future husband to Queen Elizabeth II, whose presence around the unit brought many of the Wrens unending delight, as one put it. And there was the writer Nicholas Montserrat, who would go on to describe in his 1951 novel The Cruel Sea a convoy game played out with model ships on the floor of an empty room, clearly based on his experience at WATU. In addition to the thousands of British naval officers who completed the course, Roberts and the Wrens trained delegates from the United States to India, Malaya to Norway, and at least 4 university professors. Many graduates of the game credited the battles they waged on the linoleum floor as being instrumental in their subsequent victories during real encounters with U-boats at sea. Similar tactical units sprang up across the British Empire, some of which were also staffed by young Wrens, who, by playing the game time and time again, also became experts in anti-submarine warfare. By 1945, a total of 66 Wrens had completed the course in order to become staff at WATU or one of its sister units. 2,603 merchant ships and 175 of the escorting naval vessels were sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic, which was the longest continuous military campaign in the Second World War. More than 30,000 merchant seamen and more than 6,000 Royal Navy sailors died in the Atlantic during the war, many in attacks staged by U-boats. It was an astonishing loss of life, tempered somewhat by the work of the men and women of WATU and the sailors who deployed their tactics at sea. At the end of the war, Sir Max Horton, the Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, who had been defeated in the game by two of WATU's Wrens, sent the following personal signal. On the closing down of WATU, I wish to express my gratitude and high appreciation of the magnificent work of Captain Roberts and his staff, which has contributed in no small measure to the final defeat of Germany. It was an incandescent tribute to their quiet, momentous achievement. Later, Churchill famously wrote the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. Without Roberts and the Wren's work, the Battle of the Atlantic may have been lost, and perhaps the war with it. 4 weeks after the U-boats retreated from the Atlantic, my own grandfather, who was 17 years old, made his inaugural journey across the ocean in a merchant ship protected by naval officers who had been trained by WATU. Thanks in major part to WATU's work, he arrived in New York untouched. Many of those involved in WATU's work never spoke of their role in the war. While the group's feat and contribution has been barely remembered, by the fall of Berlin in 1945, the U-boat commanders were intimately familiar with Roberts, his team and their tactics. Roberts spoke fluent German, and he was one of the first British officers to land in Germany following Nazi surrender. He was, in fact, in Berlin the night the Americans performed their final bombing raid of the war. Then, the following day, Roberts eagerly travelled to U-boat headquarters in the German town of Flensburg. There he met the veteran submarine commander, the architect of the Wolfpack tactic, and the man who, later that week, would become Hitler's successor as President of Germany, Admiral Karl Dönitz. The men exchanged respectful salutes, but the other U-boat captains appeared to blanch at the sight of Roberts. Their fear was soon explained. As Roberts began his tour of the facility, he visited the U-boat operations room. There, enlarged and tacked to a wall, he saw his photograph, taken from a magazine article, and beneath the image a handwritten caption, "This is your enemy, Captain Roberts, Director of Anti-U-Boat Tactics." Games are usually dismissed as childish pursuits, something to be set down in adolescence, maybe picked up again only in retirement. But as Major Chomick explained to me in Shrivenham that night, in times of great turmoil, war games rise in popularity and importance. That was true in 1942, and as office rooms in the Pentagon and Whitehall resound with the rattle of dice, it is equally true today. Thanks so much for coming along to my talk. If you would like to read more about WATU and the work it did and its achievements, then please feel free to pick up a copy of my book, A Game of Birds and Wolves. You can follow me on Twitter at Simon Parkin, and if you want to email or anything like that, then my website is simonparkin.com. Thank you very much.